Lord, this morning as we focus our attention for a brief spell on our nation's capital and all that happens in that great city, we pray for all those persons who have given their lives in one way or another to the service of our country, to our elected officials who serve as representatives of the people and craft the legislation and policy that affects daily life in America, as well as our relationships with nations around the world. For those persons who serve in staff positions in support of the legislative process, for those who serve in the federal judiciary, both at the Supreme Court level and throughout the federal court system, as they handle the cases that come before them, some of ordinary and rather mundane significance and others of profound significance in the life of our country. For those persons who serve at the Pentagon and plan for the defense of this nation, and for those who are sent into battle especially, we pray that you would continue to extend the umbrella of your safety net across them and over them and around them. And for those whose lives are lost in battle, we pray that your profound comfort will come to their loved ones and to the nation as we mourn and grieve their passing. And for others who are brought to this great city that serves as our national capital for whatever reason brings them there, we're grateful that so many families in our country still find the nation's capital a magnet to come to for their family vacations, and how impressive it was to see so many of them during spring break just 2 weeks ago, making the rounds of the government buildings and of the museums and the mall and the monuments that mark our nation, our history as a nation. So Lord, with all these things in our minds and hearts, help us to celebrate the role to which you've called us United Methodists and other people of faith in the heart of our nation's capital. These things we ask in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, as you perhaps have read in the Circuit Rider that came out a week or so ago, Cora Lee, Sue Boshin, and Catherine Keller and I all had the opportunity to go to Washington, D.C. the week after Easter for the Large Church Initiative Conference. I've served on the LCI committee since 1996 or 97, and our committee is the group that works with local hosts each year to plan the LCI conference, and we have gone to a different city in the country every year. I was especially excited about our gathering in D.C. this year because it gave us an opportunity to connect with the long history the Methodist Church has in the heart of the nation, and more specifically in the heart of the nation's capital. In the year 1784, the Methodist Church held its founding conference, its organizing conference, at the Lovely Lane Chapel in Baltimore, Maryland, a mere decade after the founding of the nation. Our church followed the movement to settle the West when Ohio and Kentucky were the western frontier. There was such a time. Our circuit riders went wherever the American people went and established Methodist churches at nearly every crossroad back then. This is why we have so many Methodist churches in Ohio, over 700 of them in East Ohio alone. Mayfield was one of those hundreds of churches planted by those early Methodist circuit riders. And due to their faithful efforts, there was a time when 3 out of every 5 Ohio citizens was a Methodist. That's a pretty incredible thought to think about. 3 out of every 5 Ohio citizens were Methodists. The early leaders of the church had a burning vision for influencing the life of the young nation. They had sent a delegation to meet with George Washington to assure the new president of the Methodist prayers and for the new nation, and to pledge to be a voice of faith and conscience in the nation's affairs. Abraham Lincoln joined the Methodist Missionary Society while attending a meeting of that group at the Foundry Methodist Church in Washington, D.C., and he also wrote a letter to the Methodist Church during the Civil War, thanking the Methodist people for sending more soldiers and raising up to God more prayers than any other church organization at that time had done. In May of 1852, a group of Methodists from Washington, D.C. approached the General Conference of the Methodist Episcopal Church about the possibility of erecting a representational church for the denomination in the nation's capital. The General Conference approved the idea, and soon an agent was appointed to handle construction and a national fundraising effort. On October 23, 1854, the cornerstone of the new church was laid at the corner of 4.5 and C Streets Northwest. But the construction would not get beyond the foundation before a poor economy and the Civil War would stop the work. In 1866, construction resumed, and the church was dedicated on February 28, 1869, with the first members joining on Easter Sunday, March 28, 1869. In November of 1871, a 240-foot spire and 11-bell chime set were dedicated and the building was complete. By the early decades of the 20th century, the city of Washington was growing, and as its neighborhoods changed, Metropolitan Church found itself in an area with a declining residential population and its traditional core membership of middle and upper class whites moving further into the northwest sections of the city. Then in the late 1920s, the federal government laid out plans for a new center of federal and local offices, and Metropolitan Memorial Church sat very near the center of this plan. So with much reluctance but little choice, the church was sold to the government and closed its doors on December 31st, 1930, and the now present Judiciary Square was built in its place. Construction of the present Metropolitan Memorial United Methodist Church across the street from American University, a United Methodist related institution of higher education, but that construction began in 1931 of the new church building. And on February 7th, 1932, the new church was dedicated and the congregation set out doing ministry at their new home. Over the years, several presidents and justices of the Supreme Court have been members of the Metropolitan Memorial Methodist Church, including President Ulysses S. Grant, William McKinley, Richard Nixon, and Supreme Court Justice Harry Blackmun. The Nixon's daughters, Julie and Tricia, were confirmed as members of the Methodist Church and Metropolitan Church. At the turn of the 20th century, when the church was still at its original location at 4.5 and C Streets, President William McKinley, who was from Ohio, most of you recall, regularly attended services at Metropolitan, just as Ulysses S. Grant had done some 25 years earlier. In fact, President McKinley and Mrs. McKinley would regularly greet people as they left church on Sunday morning, and he was frequently seen on his knees at the communion rail of the church on Communion Sundays. The marble plaque pictured on the screen is found in the present-day sanctuary of Metropolitan Memorial Church. It reads about McKinley, "A man of immaculate purity, he walked in perfect and noble self-control. He fell on the zenith of his power and in the glory of a matchless career." He was assassinated, as you may recall. It was reported in the Christian Herald, December 7th, 1898, that if President McKinley was not in his pew on Sunday morning, that the pastor knew that something very extraordinary demanded his time at the White House. He was a regular churchgoer. After his assassination, the pew where the president sat was draped in black and covered with flowers and palms for years afterwards. Our conference met at Metropolitan Memorial United Methodist Church on Wednesday morning of that week for a prayer service, and we were addressed in that service by Bishop James K. Matthews, who is the son-in-law of the late Methodist missionary E. Stanley Jones, and also by Jim Wallace, the editor of Sojourners Magazine and the author of the book God's Politics. We also learned that when the General Conference authorized the construction of Metropolitan Church, and by the way, it is the only church in our whole connection that was authorized to be established directly by a General Conference. But in that same action, the General Conference declared that every member of every Methodist church across the country was also an honorary member of Metropolitan Memorial, because it was in their mind that Metropolitan would become the national Methodist church in Washington, D.C. Now, you probably never heard that before. I'd never heard that before sitting in the sanctuary of Metropolitan Church that morning just a couple of weeks ago. We've all heard about Presbyterian National Church, and even more of us have heard about the National Cathedral, which is the Episcopalians' national church in Washington, D.C. But how many of you really have ever heard that we Methodists had a national church in Washington, D.C.? Just as I thought. You're as smart as I have been about this. But that was the intent. Now, the pastor emeritus of Metropolitan confessed to us that unlike the Presbyterians and the Episcopalians, we Methodists have never quite figured out what it means to have a national church in the nation's capital. Aside from the fact that we've not made much of it, like the National Presbyterian Church and the National Cathedral, we have the National Methodist Church in Washington, D.C., and you and I have dual membership here at Mayfield and at Metropolitan. So if you ever go to D.C., find your way out to the campus of American University, and across the street on Nebraska Avenue, you will find Metropolitan United Methodist Church, your other church home as a United Methodist Christian. Well, when the LCI committee first began to talk about Washington, D.C. as a possible site, not everybody on the committee was persuaded that we should go there. For one thing, none of the host churches were really what we would call large churches by our definition within our denomination. But several of us, and I was among the few who encouraged us to go, suggested that the theme of the conference focus on the prophetic ministry of the church at the heart of the nation's capital. I also suggested the idea of taking Wednesday afternoon and offering information tours at various sites around the city. I especially urged the local host committee to arrange visits to Lovely Lane Chapel in Baltimore, where our denomination was birthed, and also the Methodist Building in Washington, D.C., which houses the offices of the General Board of Church and Society. Now, many United Methodists in our connection feel a certain level of alienation from our denomination's social stances, and the Board of Church and Society is often seen as representing the far left wing of the church. This perception is not altogether true, however, and I was especially eager myself to visit the Methodist Building to see another side of the picture. Jessica Moffitt from Bixby, Oklahoma, is one of my fellow members on the LCI committee, and she's also a member of the Board of Directors of the General Board of Church and Society. So Jessica offered to speak at one of our plenary sessions in Washington, D.C., to share with the conference about United Methodism's strong presence and clear influence in our nation's capital. So the balance of my reflections this morning are really taken from what she shared with our conference 2 weeks ago. Jessica began by describing a bit of our history in the capital and then shared with us some specific laws that have been influenced because of the voice and the work of the United Methodist Church. First, she gave us a sense about the physical, visible presence that we have with the United Methodist Building at 100 Maryland Avenue. Our United Methodist Building is located directly across the street to the east entrance, directly across the street to the east from the Capitol entrance. It is a 5-story building, of which you'll see a picture of in just a moment, that can be seen through the windows when you stand inside the Capitol, when there's no construction going on, as there has been more recently. The Methodist Building is also directly north of the imposing Supreme Court building with its monumental steps. In fact, this view of the Supreme Court building, as you see on the screen, was taken from the window of the General Secretary of the Board of Church and Society, Jim Winkler. As we took our tour of the building, they ushered us into his office. He was away on a trip on business for the board, and we got to stand in his office for quite some time and enjoy the view. Out one window was the Supreme Court building, and out another window was the Capitol building. That's where we're located, at the heart of the nation's capital. Around each corner of the United Methodist Building, there are also countless offices of senators and members of Congress. And we've also built an apartment building adjacent to the Methodist Building, where many members of Congress and sometimes some justices of the Supreme Court have rented apartments from us. Our United Methodist Building is the only non-governmental building on Capitol Hill. I'd like for that to sink in for just a moment. Our United Methodist Building is the only non-governmental building on all of Capitol Hill. That building currently houses our United Methodist General Board of Church and Society and other offices of ministries that work to influence legislation. The General Board of Church and Society was created by the General Conference to fulfill the social resolutions, our social creed, and our social principles adopted at General Conference. Now, it's often thought that the General Board is the General Board of Church and Society is kind of a maverick board that's out there doing its own thing. But in fact, it was created and it exists and it is faithful to its charge to carry out the actions of our general conferences, which meet every 4 years and is equivalent to the Congress of the United Methodist Church in terms of our church polity, our organizational structure. And the petitions that are sent to General Conference every 4 years by members of local Methodist churches sitting in the pew, by local church administrative boards, by conferences, by other boards and agencies of the denomination, and are considered by General Conference and enacted by General Conference, particularly those that deal with social-related issues. Those resolutions and those actions by General Conference are then delegated to the General Board of Church and Society to carry out and enact in the life of the denomination, and most of them are aimed at lifting our United Methodist voice of faith in the affairs of the nation. And the General Board of Church and Society is well positioned both within our polity and within its location on Capitol Hill to carry out that mission. It is an important mission. And the General Board of Church and Society is one of just 4 international boards that our denomination has authorized. Now you might wonder, how did it end up that we have this prime piece of real estate right next door to the Supreme Court? Well, for one thing, when we obtained that property, the Supreme Court building had not yet been built. It wasn't built until the 1930s, and we began to be interested in the plot of ground that we ended up buying in 1917, when a few visionary Methodists noticed across the street from the Capitol building a corner lot that they wrote was a muddy, billboard-cluttered corner. 100 years ago, that's what it was. And the Methodist Episcopal denomination, which was the Methodist Church at that particular time in the North, decided way back then that it would be the perfect site from which to influence our government for the cause of Christ and the social reforms for which we stood. At the building's dedication in 1920, leading up to the construction of the building in 1920, here's what Bishop William McDowell said. The Methodist Episcopal Church ought to have a worthy building at the nation's capital. We now have the perfect site and perfect plans. The new building will make our church visible and multiply its power at this world center. And so in 1923, we completed the building in an Italian Renaissance style. It is constructed of Indiana limestone that is as beautiful today as it was the year it was built. In that year, 1923, this building cost a whopping $650,000 to build. 5 stories, Indiana limestone. Prime real estate in the nation's capital. Can you believe it? Money for the project was given by individuals and churches. There is record that some gifts were as small as 15 cents. But then that's back when 3 nickels was really worth something. Clarence True Wilson and his wife Maud Aiken Wilson worked tirelessly going across the country to raise the funds to build the Methodist Building. Clarence was a gifted orator and debater and gained quite a reputation traveling around the country with Clarence Darrow, the famous attorney of the Scopes Monkey trial fame. And the two of them would hold public debates when such things served as lively entertainment in the town halls and theaters of the land. Now, can you imagine a time in American history when movies hadn't quite come along yet, or they had not hit their heyday, and certainly long before cable television, and even longer before the internet? And the thing that many people turned to for entertainment in those days was a traveling troupe of speakers or actors, but oftentimes speakers and orators would come to town, and they go get on their soapboxes and basically entertain an audience for a whole evening. And Clarence Darrow and Clarence Wilson did that for many years. Clarence's wife, Maud, was also a mover and a shaker, a person who got things done, giving her life and energy to national causes. She is the first woman, a Methodist person, but she is the first woman to have her statue included in Statuary Hall in the rotunda of the nation's capital. The conference room in the Methodist Building is named in their honor, and as a reminder of the role they played on behalf of us Methodists in the life of our nation. We'll come back to this conference room, but you'd only see the plaque in their honor in just a few moments. But in the building, in the United Methodist Building, there is a beautiful chapel that was built with the vision that many who shaped our nation's government would come there for prayer and surrender and seeking God as they worked on the nation's business. The chapel is named for a close friend of Abraham Lincoln's and is called the Simpson Memorial Chapel. Our building was dedicated on January 16th, 1924, and one of the speakers at that dedication was the famous orator William Jennings Bryan. Do you see the interweaving here? Clarence Wilson went around the country debating with Clarence Darrow, and Clarence Darrow represented the government in the Scopes Monkey trial, and William Jennings Bryan was the defending attorney. What a small world it was. But here's what William Jennings Bryan said to us Methodists on that day. He said, we Methodists must do 3 things in the life of our nation. We must be a voice for the Christian values. We must be a visible witness for Christ and his redemption. And we must do all in our power to do justice and to influence social reform. And in his speech at the consecration, Pennsylvania Governor Gifford Pinchot talked about how important it was for our efforts at Capitol Hill to be continual and not spasmodic. He said our presence needs to be made known all of the time, reminding our nation's leaders of the strong voice and vote of the religious community. Our Methodist Building on Capitol Hill is significant for the continual work that is done there, but also for the role it has played at turning points in our nation's history. Our very earliest efforts as socially minded progressive Methodists included the fight for prohibition, which was successful. We worked to put into place laws against gambling and obscenity in publications and films. And as the years unfolded, human and civil rights also became a core issue. In fact, on the night that Congress adopted the law making Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday a national holiday, Coretta Scott King brought many of her friends and supporters across the street from the Capitol building to the United Methodist Building, to Simpson's Chapel, where they held a celebration service during which 150 candles that she carried with her in her pocketbook were lighted in celebration and to give thanks. This next view of our building is taken from across the broad plaza in front of the Supreme Court building. Perched on this strategic site, the United Methodist Building has been the focal point for many ecumenical events, such as the 1968 Poor People's March and the Farmers' Boycott. There was a tractorcade in 1979. We helped organize the 1978 Longest Walk of Native Americans, the 1989 Housing Now March, and the Children's March in the 1990s that included almost every bishop in our denomination. But one of the major movements to be supported through our building was the work on equal rights. Early on in the struggle for equal rights for women, women's rights supporters who were Methodists joined with women from the Prohibition movement and the women from the anti-slavery movement to begin the women's movement. Later, supporters of the Equal Rights Amendment used the building as a center for organizing during the 70s and 80s. And since that time, the building has been the center of the ecumenical community's work on many topics, such as racism, economic justice, homelessness, HIV/AIDS, peace, hunger and poverty, terrorism, mental health, immigration, human rights, child advocacy, fair wage, health and pharmaceuticals, tobacco, gambling, alcohol abuse and underage drinking, anti-pornography, environment, and the list goes on and on and on. Listen to this paragraph from the Book of Discipline. The primary responsibility of the General Board of Church and Society is to seek the implementation of the social principles and other policy statements of the General Conference about Christian social concerns. Furthermore, the board shall provide forthright witness and action on issues of human well-being, justice, peace, and the integrity of creation that call Christians to respond as forgiven people for whom Christ died. That language is from our Book of Discipline and is very close to the kind of language that you saw on the screen a moment ago from our 1972 Social Creed. It's a truism that nearly every major progressive step forward in a society is met with stiff opposition by those who benefit from the way things are presently structured. But years later, after those changes have been effected and accepted into our society, sometimes even generations later, the changes that were so hard fought for and so dearly won are universally accepted as having benefited the quality of our life in our society. For example, who among us today would want to speak up in favor of any of the issues that were the focus of the first Methodist Social Creed in 1906? That's the one that's on the screen right now. I was hoping I could read from it, but I can't. It's really blurry for me. Is it blurry for you? I'm glad to hear that, because I know I haven't been drinking anything this morning. But there are things in this social creed that dates back to 1906, like a stand against the practice of sweatshops. We pretty much have rooted that out of the economic practices of our country. We still take that stand against sweatshops internationally. There is on this list of issues that were identified by our church in 1906 a great concern about child labor laws and the lack of them. There was a concern that workers be given at least one day off, free from work. That was back in a time when people worked 7 days, 24/7, never got a rest. And they started at a very early age. There are other issues on this list of the social creed of the 1906 Methodist Church that all of which we would be supportive of today because we have seen how these changes have benefited the quality of our life in America. Well, certainly our presence has been important over the years, and the use of our building by so many influential groups has been important. But you may wonder, where in recent years can we document that the work of the United Methodist Church specifically influenced the outcome of current legislation? Can we directly trace our impact on legislation that led to lives being changed and protected and transformed in our lifetime? Well, Jessica Moffat found many illustrations of our continuing influence, but shared only 3 of them with us during our conference week in D.C. And the first one is the American Disabilities Act. Did you know that the American Disabilities Act was crafted by a group of people that included our Methodist staff, Congress members, their staff, and other religious coalition staff crafted it together. And they met weekly in our building in the Wilson Conference Room. The conference room where you saw the plaque a moment ago, named after Clarence Wilson and his wife, Maud. The language for the working draft of the American Disabilities Act came from our United Methodist office, and it was written to protect it was about the protection of jobs and the building of ramps and access issues, and it was written on this very table that you're looking at now in the Wilson Conference Room. So there's the trail. General Conference voted in the resolutions about disability. The General Board of Church and Society helped bring the parties together and draft the law that was passed. With our help and our influence as Methodist Christians, legislation passed, and it was revolutionary to the world of the disabled. A second clear connection to result is the work we are doing in the area of tobacco. We are working with the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids, a coalition started by the Southern Baptists to work against marketing tobacco, especially to teenagers. Every day, at least 3,900 youth try their first cigarettes. Every day. 1,500 of those youth daily will become everyday smokers. The campaign is also working to stop marketing to teenagers and working to give authority to the Food and Drug Administration to regulate tobacco. Apparently, the FDA can regulate more what's in dog food more than they can regulate what's in tobacco. Matt Myers is one of the leaders of the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids, and he said that the huge progress that has been made could not have been done without the United Methodist influence. The two key players, he said, have been the United Methodist Church and the Seventh-day Adventists. Our work has made the difference. Internet gambling is the third area. We had a large part in working on the legislation to control internet gambling. We worked with Senator Kyle's. Senator Kyle's staff has said the crucial player in getting the legislation passed is the United Methodist Church, your strategy and your leadership. He said if you had pulled out, the legislation would have been dead. Well, there are many more specific laws that have been shaped or formed by our activity in the public sphere. Last October, Jessica Moffitt went with a staff member from the Board of Church and Society and a few other of the board members of the Board of Church and Society to be a lobbyist for the day on Capitol Hill. They first went to the office of the senator from New York. Now, Jessica didn't name that senator, but I think everybody in the room knew she was referring to Hillary Clinton. And she went there to talk about global AIDS funding. Jessica said, here I was, a pastor from Oklahoma, getting to express my views about the human compassion elements of AIDS funding. We went to other offices to be the continual reminder, as the governor has stated at the consecration in 1924, of the voice of faith, the voice of religious voters, and the ethic of Christ. Certainly, we as United Methodists do not agree on everything, but we do agree on many things that have to do with poverty, protection of the vulnerable, human compassion, care of God's earth, and the dignity of all people. We are at work, visible and influential, on Capitol Hill. Jim Wallace reminded us in his address to our conference that many times in our history as a nation, the pulpit has changed the country. As America's preachers found their voices and the voice of the church and the voice of the gospel and proclaimed a message that ignited people's hearts and imaginations and souls, change has occurred, and it still does and still will. Now, you and I have lived in a time when many people in the church and beyond the church have felt rather strongly that the church has no business being involved in politics. Yet we have seen deep involvement in the political process by both the religious left and the religious right, and some are sensing a growing wave of concerned involvement by the religious center. Whatever your political persuasion might be, we can be grateful that in the 1920s, there were some Methodists with a vision for how the church could establish its physical as well as its spiritual presence in the nation's capital. And there we are, holding out a standing invitation to every lawmaker, lobbyist, and interested citizen to gather for prayer in the Simpson Chapel in the Methodist Building, right next door to the Supreme Court and right across the street from the nation's Capitol building. Only God knows how many of our nation's leaders across the years have found their way to our building and to our chapel to seek divine guidance in the affairs of state. I don't know about you, but I say to all this, thanks be to God